There's a reason our ancestors feared the dark spaces between the trees. Something primal lives in that fear, something that predates language and civilization and everything we've built to convince ourselves we're safe. The wilderness doesn't care about us. It existed for millions of years before humans walked upright, and it will exist for millions of years after we're gone. When you step off the marked trail, when you pitch your tent in a clearing miles from the nearest road, when you lie awake listening to sounds you can't identify, you're entering a world that operates by rules we've forgotten, rules we were never meant to understand. The following 3 accounts come from experienced outdoorsmen and women who thought they knew what they were doing. They'd hiked hundreds of miles. They'd camped in remote locations dozens of times. They knew the wilderness, or they thought they did, until they encountered something that made them realize the wilderness knew them far better than they could ever know it. Marcus Holloway had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections for almost 7 years. He'd started in Georgia right after his divorce, when he needed something to fill the empty weekends that used to belong to someone else. The trail became his therapy, his meditation, his escape from a world that had grown too complicated, too demanding, too full of voices telling him who to be. In the wilderness, there was only the next step, the next mile marker, the next campsite. By October of 2019, Marcus had completed nearly 2/3 of the trail's 2,190 miles. He was 46 years old, in the best shape of his life, and planning to finish the entire thing by his 50th birthday. The section he'd chosen for that late autumn weekend was a remote stretch in southwestern Virginia. Not the most scenic part of the trail, but that was the point. Marcus didn't want company. He wanted silence. He wanted the particular peace that comes from being so far from other people that you stop performing, stop pretending, stop being anything except exactly what you are. He'd hiked 12 miles that first day, good progress for the terrain, which was rocky and uneven, the trail winding through dense forest that blocked out most of the afternoon light. By 5 p.m., the sun was already dropping behind the ridge, and Marcus started looking for a suitable campsite. He found it about half a mile off the main trail, a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, with relatively flat ground and a fallen log that would work as a seat while he cooked dinner. He set up his one-person tent with practiced efficiency, started a small fire, boiled water for freeze-dried beef stroganoff that tasted better than it had any right to. He was in his sleeping bag by 8 p.m., reading by headlamp, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. Crickets, an owl somewhere in the distance, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, the sounds that had lulled him to sleep on 100 different nights in 100 different clearings. He turned off his headlamp around 9:30 and fell asleep almost immediately. He woke at 3:17 a.m. He knew the exact time because he checked his watch immediately. Something had pulled him out of a deep sleep, not gradually, the way you wake from a fading dream, but suddenly, completely, as if someone had shouted his name. He lay still in his sleeping bag, not breathing, trying to identify what had woken him. For a long moment there was nothing, just the silence of the forest in the deep hours of night. Even the crickets had stopped. And then he heard it. Footsteps. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around his tent, stepping on the dry leaves that carpeted the clearing. Marcus could track the sound as it moved, starting at what he estimated was the 9 o'clock position relative to his tent door, moving clockwise. Crunch, 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 each step distinct, each step patient. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. Marcus's first thought was another hiker, someone who'd gotten lost in the dark and stumbled onto his campsite. It happened. Not often, but it happened. He reached for his headlamp, intending to call out, to ask if they needed help, but something stopped him. The footsteps had completed a full circle around his tent, and now they were starting again. Same path, same pace, same sounds in exactly the same sequence. It was then that Marcus noticed something that made his skin crawl. The footsteps weren't varying at all. When you walk, even on a familiar path, there are small differences each time. Your stride lengthens or shortens. You step on slightly different leaves. The sounds change. But these footsteps were identical, the same crunches in the same order at the same intervals, like a recording, like someone had captured the sound of a person walking around his tent and was playing it on a loop, circle after circle after circle. He checked his watch again, 3:24 a.m. He'd been listening for 7 minutes. The footsteps continued. He had to look. He had to look. Whatever was out there, not knowing was worse than knowing. He couldn't spend the rest of the night lying in his tent, paralyzed, listening to those endlessly circling feet. He reached for his headlamp.
There's a reason our ancestors feared the dark spaces between the trees. Something primal lives in that fear. Something that predates language and civilization and everything we've built to convince ourselves we're safe. The wilderness doesn't care about us. It existed for millions of years before humans walked upright, and it will exist for millions of years after we're gone. When you step off the marked trail, when you pitch your tent in a clearing miles from the nearest road, when you lie awake listening to sounds you can't identify, you're entering a world that operates by rules we've forgotten, rules we were never meant to understand. The following 3 accounts come from experienced outdoorsmen and women who thought they knew what they were doing. They'd hiked hundreds of miles. They'd camped in remote locations dozens of times. They knew the wilderness, or they thought they did, until they encountered something that made them realize the wilderness knew them far better than they could ever know it. Marcus Holloway had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections for almost 7 years. He'd started in Georgia right after his divorce, when he needed something to fill the empty weekends that used to belong to someone else. The trail became his therapy, his meditation, his escape from a world that had grown too complicated, too demanding, too full of voices telling him who to be. In the wilderness, there was only the next step, the next mile marker, the next campsite. By October of 2019, Marcus had completed nearly 2/3 of the trail's 2,190 miles. He was 46 years old, in the best shape of his life, and planning to finish the entire thing by his 50th birthday. The section he'd chosen for that late autumn weekend was a remote stretch in southwestern Virginia. Not the most scenic part of the trail, but that was the point. Marcus didn't want company. He wanted silence. He wanted the particular peace that comes from being so far from other people that you stop performing, stop pretending, stop being anything except exactly what you are. He'd hiked 12 miles that first day. Good progress for the terrain, which was rocky and uneven, the trail winding through dense forest that blocked out most of the afternoon light. By 5 p.m., the sun was already dropping behind the ridge, and Marcus started looking for a suitable campsite. He found it about half a mile off the main trail, a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, with relatively flat ground and a fallen log that would work as a seat while he cooked dinner. He set up his one-person tent with practiced efficiency, started a small fire, boiled water for freeze-dried beef stroganoff that tasted better than it had any right to.
He was in his sleeping bag by 8 p.m., reading by headlamp, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. Crickets, an owl somewhere in the distance, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, the sounds that had lulled him to sleep on 100 different nights in 100 different clearings. He turned off his headlamp around 9:30 and fell asleep almost immediately. He woke at 3:17 a.m. He knew the exact time because he checked his watch immediately. Something had pulled him out of a deep sleep, not gradually, the way you wake from a fading dream, but suddenly, completely, as if someone had shouted his name. He lay still in his sleeping bag, not breathing, trying to identify what had woken him. For a long moment there was nothing, just the silence of the forest in the deep hours of night. Even the crickets had stopped, and then he heard it. Footsteps. Positioned his thumb on the switch, counted to 3, and threw open the 10th door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing in a harsh white cone. The trees at the edge, the fire pit where embers still glowed faintly, the fallen log where he'd eaten dinner, and nothing else. No one. The clearing was empty, but the footsteps continued. Marcus swept his headlamp in a full arc, following the sound. The crunching was coming from the edge of the clearing, moving, circling. He could hear it. He could hear it clearly, but there was nothing there, nothing visible, nothing his light could find. He stayed in the doorway of his tent, headlamp sweeping back and forth for the next 2 hours. The footsteps never stopped, never varied, never acknowledged his light or his presence, just continued their endless circuit around his tent, circling, circling, circling. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the footsteps stopped, mid-circle, just stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. Marcus didn't pack up his tent. He didn't eat breakfast. He didn't do anything except wait for full daylight, then walk to the edge of the clearing and look at the ground. There should have been footprints. The previous day's rain had left the ground soft. His own boots had left clear impressions everywhere he'd walked, but there were no other prints, none. The only marks in the mud were his own, from setting up camp the evening before. What he did find was worse, a perfect circle of dead vegetation around his tent. Grass that was green yesterday was now brown and brittle. Leaves that were merely dry were now gray and crumbling. A ring of death, maybe 18 inches wide, traced the exact path the footsteps had followed. As if something had walked that circle so many times it had drained the life from everything it touched. Marcus packed up and hiked out. 12 miles in 5 hours. He didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't look back. When he reached his car at the trailhead, he sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine, just breathing, just trying to make his hands stop shaking. He didn't report the incident. What would he say? Who would believe him? He told himself he would forget about it, that it was a strange experience he would never explain and eventually stop thinking about. Then, 6 months later, he found the article. He wasn't looking for it. He was researching a different section of the trail, planning a future hike, and he stumbled across a blog post about unsolved disappearances on the Appalachian Trail. One entry caught his eye. A man named Douglas Kern, age 33, who had vanished in October of 1987. His last known location was a section of trail in southwestern Virginia, the same section Marcus had hiked. The GPS coordinates listed in the missing person report matched the location of Marcus's campsite within 50 feet. But that wasn't what made Marcus's blood go cold. It was the witness statements. Other hikers who had camped in that area in the weeks after Douglas Kern's disappearance reported hearing strange sounds at night, footsteps circling their tents for hours, always stopping at dawn. Douglas Kern's body was never found. The footsteps, according to the reports, continued for about 6 weeks after he vanished. Then they stopped, until, apparently, Marcus arrived 32 years later. He hasn't been back to that section of the trail. He hasn't been back to any section of the trail. He sold his hiking gear, gave up the Appalachian Trail with 800 miles left to complete. Some nights in his apartment in suburban Virginia, he still wakes at 3:17 a.m. He lies very still in the darkness and listens, because sometimes, just before he falls back asleep, he thinks he can hear it, faintly, in the distance, the sound of footsteps circling.
Sarah Mendez had been taking her daughter camping since Emma was old enough to walk. It was their thing, the one tradition that had survived Sarah's second divorce, Emma's turbulent teenage years, and the general chaos of trying to raise a child while working 2 jobs and wondering if she was doing any of it right. The wilderness was the one place where none of that mattered, where Sarah felt like a good mother, where Emma seemed genuinely happy. By the time Emma was 16, they'd established a routine. 1 long camping trip every summer, usually a week in one of the Michigan state forests, where the trails were well maintained, but the backcountry was wild enough to feel like an adventure. August of 2021, they chose a route in the Manistee National Forest, a 3-day loop that would take them about 40 miles through old-growth hardwoods and along the banks of the Little Manistee River. Emma had her own pack now, her own tent, her own responsibilities. She wasn't a kid who needed to be watched every second. She was a competent outdoorswoman in her own right. Sarah was proud of that, proud of who her daughter was becoming. They made good time the first day, 12 miles through gorgeous forest, the trail winding between ancient oaks that filtered the summer sunlight into shifting green and gold. They set up camp near the river, ate a dinner of instant noodles and trail mix, and talked until the stars came out. Normal. Perfect. Everything a camping trip should be. The second day started the same way. They broke camp at dawn, hiked another 6 miles, and stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook where they could see the forest stretching toward the horizon in an unbroken sea of green. It was early afternoon when they noticed the smell. Smoke, but not the distant, diffuse smell of a faraway fire. This was close, fresh. Emma noticed it first. "Mom, someone's got a fire going. We're not near a designated campsite, are we?" Sarah checked her map. The nearest marked site was 3 miles ahead, but the smoke was coming from a small trail that branched off to the east, a trail that wasn't on her map at all. They should have kept walking, should have minded their own business and continued to the designated site. That's what experienced hikers did. But the smoke was concerning. It was mid-August, and conditions were dry. An unattended fire could turn into a disaster. Sarah made the decision to investigate, to make sure someone wasn't being careless, to make sure everything was under control. She would regret that decision for the rest of her life. The unmarked trail led about a 1/4 mile into the woods. It ended at a small clearing where someone had set up camp, recently, very recently. A fire was burning in a stone ring at the center of the clearing, not embers, an active fire, with fresh logs that had been added within the last hour. A pot of water hung over the flames. It was boiling. There was a tent, blue and gray, a 2-person model that Sarah recognized from REI catalogs. The door was unzipped, hanging open. Inside she could see a sleeping bag, a pillow, a small lantern. Personal belongings were scattered around the site, a hiking boot near the fire, a jacket draped over a log, a water bottle on its side in the grass, still half full, and a backpack, torn open, its contents spilled across the ground as if someone had been searching for something in a panic. "Hello?" Sarah called. "Is anyone here?" No response, just the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. Maybe they're collecting firewood, or went to the river for water.
Maybe, but Sarah didn't believe it. Something about this scene felt wrong. The randomness of it, the way things were scattered, the fire burning with no one to tend it. It looked less like someone had stepped away and more like someone had been interrupted. She walked toward the tent, intending to check if there was any identification inside, a name, a phone number, someone she could contact to make sure the camper was okay. That's when she saw the journal. It was lying open on the ground near the sleeping bag, a small leather-bound notebook with cream-colored pages. She picked it up without thinking, opened to the last entry. The handwriting was neat at the beginning of the page, becoming more rushed toward the end, more jagged, as if the writer had been growing increasingly agitated. August 14th, third night alone. Should have hiked out today, but didn't. Something was wrong. I keep hearing movement in the trees. Not animals. Animals don't move like that. They don't stop when I stop. They start when I start. Something is watching me. I can feel it. I've been trying to convince myself I'm imagining things, but I'm not. I can hear it outside the tent, and I think it's been watching us since we... The entry stopped mid-sentence. The pen trailed off the page in a long, thin line, as if the writer had been pulled away. Sarah felt Emma's hand on her arm. Her grip was painful, painful. "Mom," Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What day is it?" Sarah looked at the journal entry again. August 14th. She checked her watch. August 17th. This entry had been written 3 days ago. The fire was still burning. The water was still boiling. The food in the pot, some kind of dehydrated meal, was still warm to the touch. And the camper was gone.
They didn't touch anything else. Didn't look through the rest of the journal. Didn't try to find answers. Sarah grabbed Emma's hand, and they hiked out as fast as they could safely move. The designated campsite was 3 miles away. A ranger station was another 2 miles beyond that. They could report what they'd found, let professionals handle whatever had happened in that clearing. Let someone else figure out why a fire was burning 3 days after its owner had disappeared. But 15 minutes into their hike, Emma suddenly stopped. "Mom, listen." Sarah stopped, listened. For a moment, she heard only normal forest sounds: wind, birds, the distant babble of the river. Then she heard it. Footsteps, coming from the trees to their left, parallel to the trail, matching their pace. "Hello?" Sarah called. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence. "We found your campsite," she continued, her voice shakier than she wanted it to be. "We were concerned. If you need help..." The footsteps started again. Same direction, same distance. Just beyond the tree line where the shadows were too thick to see through. "Mom, let's go," Emma whispered. "Please, let's just go." They started walking, faster than before. Not quite running, but close. The footsteps matched them. When they slowed, the footsteps slowed. When they sped up, the footsteps sped up. Always parallel, always just beyond sight, always there. For 3 hours, all the way to the ranger station, something followed them through the trees. It never showed itself, never made a sound other than those steady, pacing footsteps. Never fell behind, never caught up, just followed. When they finally burst through the door of the ranger station, sweating and shaking and trying to explain what they'd found, the footsteps stopped. The ranger on duty, a patient man named Carl, who had clearly dealt with panicked hikers before, took their reports seriously. He radioed for backup and organized a search team. 3 hours later, they reached the clearing where Sarah and Emma had found the abandoned camp. Nothing was there.
No tent, no fire ring, no scattered belongings, no journal. The clearing was empty. Had, according to Carl, been empty for as long as he'd been patrolling this section of forest, over 20 years. But the search team found something else. Half a mile from the clearing, partially buried under years of accumulated leaves and undergrowth, they found human remains. A skeleton, male, dead for a very long time. The forensic analysis would take weeks. When the results came back, they showed the remains belonged to a man named Peter Aldrich, aged 28, reported missing in August of 2008. 13 years before Sarah and Emma found a campsite that couldn't exist, with a fire that shouldn't have been burning, and a journal describing events that hadn't happened yet. The last entry in Peter Aldrich's missing person file noted that he'd been camping alone in the Manistee National Forest. His campsite was found abandoned. His fire was still burning. His belongings were scattered as if he'd left in a hurry. But Peter Aldrich was never seen again. Sarah keeps the photograph that Emma took of the journal entry. She took it quickly, without thinking, before they started hiking out. She looks at it sometimes, at that half-finished sentence. I can hear it outside the tent, and I think it's been watching us since we... She wonders what comes next. She wonders if Peter Aldrich ever finished the sentence. She wonders if he's still trying to.
Dylan Reeves and his 4 closest friends had been planning the Colorado trip since junior year, a graduation celebration, one last adventure before they all scattered to different colleges, different cities, different lives. 5 friends who had grown up together, navigating the minefield of high school side by side, taking one final trip before everything changed. There was Dylan, the organizer, the one who had booked the campsite and mapped the route. Alexis Cho, his girlfriend of 2 years, who was the only experienced backpacker in the group. Marcus Washington, Dylan's best friend since 3rd grade, who complained constantly but always showed up when it mattered. Jennifer Osman, the quiet one, who had a talent for photography and had been documenting their friendship for years. And Tyler Brennan, the joker, who had nearly been expelled twice and was inexplicably the most responsible one when it came to actual wilderness skills. They drove up from Denver on a Thursday in early June. The campsite was in a remote section of the Roosevelt National Forest, accessible only by a 3-mile hike from the nearest road. Alexis had chosen it specifically because it was isolated. No cell service, no other campers within miles. Just 5 friends, 2 tents, and 4 days of hiking, stargazing, and saying goodbye to the best years of their lives so far. The first 2 days were perfect. They hiked to a glacier lake so blue it looked photoshopped. They watched the sunset from a ridge that made them feel like they were standing on the edge of the world. They stayed up late telling stories and drinking the beer that Tyler had somehow smuggled in his pack without anyone noticing. It felt like the trip was supposed to feel, like a proper ending, a proper beginning. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jennifer went to photograph the sunrise from a rocky outcropping about 200 yards from camp. She came back pale and silent, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "Guys," she said, "there's something you need to see." The trail camera was zip-tied to a pine tree about 50 feet from their campsite. It was positioned at chest height, angled directly toward the clearing where they'd set up their tents.
A professional model, the kind hunters use to monitor game trails. Camouflaged housing, motion-activated sensor, high-capacity SD card. "What the hell?" Marcus said. "Who puts a trail camera out here?" "Maybe rangers?" Alexis suggested. "Wildlife monitoring or something?" But the angle was wrong for wildlife. It wasn't pointed at a game trail or a water source. It was pointed at their tents, directly at them. Dylan climbed up to examine it. The camera was new, clean. The zip ties looked recently attached, the plastic still shiny and unweathered. Whatever this was, it hadn't been here long. "There's an SD card," he said. "Should we look at it?" "Absolutely not," Tyler said immediately. "That's someone's property. That's probably illegal." "Someone put a camera pointed at us while we sleep?" Jennifer said. "I think we're past worrying about property rights." Dylan removed the SD card. They gathered around Jennifer's laptop, the only device with a card reader, and waited while she loaded the files. There were hundreds of images, time-stamped, organized, spanning the entire time they'd been at the campsite. Photos of Dylan setting up the first tent on Thursday evening. Photos of Alexis starting the campfire. Photos of Marcus and Tyler arguing about something, gesturing dramatically, their faces frozen in expressions of mock outrage. Photos of all 5 of them sitting around the fire that first night, silhouettes against the flames, clearly identifiable despite the darkness. And then the photos that made Jennifer's hands start to shake. Photos from inside the tents. Tyler asleep in his sleeping bag, mouth slightly open. Marcus with his arm thrown over his face, dead to the world. Alexis curled on her side, her hair splayed across the pillow. Dylan and Jennifer in the other tent, their faces peaceful and vulnerable and completely unaware that something was photographing them while they slept. "How?" Alexis whispered. "The camera is outside. How did it take photos from inside the tents?" Dylan didn't have an answer. Neither did anyone else. Because she was right. The angles were impossible. The camera was mounted to a tree 50 feet from camp. But the photos showed perspectives from inside the tents, inches from their sleeping faces, as if someone had been standing over them in the dark, watching, photographing, and then leaving before they woke. They should have packed up immediately, should have hiked out and reported the camera to rangers, should have done anything except what Dylan actually suggested, which was to check the timestamps on the photos. He wanted to understand, wanted to make sense of it, wanted some explanation that would make this weird instead of terrifying. Jennifer scrolled through the files, checking dates and times. Thursday, 6:47 p.m., Dylan's setting up the tent. That tracked. Friday, 2:15 a.m., photos from inside the tent. That was wrong, but at least it was during their trip. Saturday, 11:32 p.m., Marcus and Tyler playing cards by firelight. That was last night. And then, photos dated Monday, June 2nd, 3 days before they'd left Denver, 3 days before they'd even packed their bags, 3 days before Dylan had finalized the campsite reservation and shared the location with the group. "That's not possible," Tyler said. "We weren't here Monday. We weren't anywhere near here Monday." But the photos showed them here, at this campsite, setting up these tents, eating by this fire. The same clothes they'd packed, the same gear they'd brought, the same angles and compositions and frozen moments, but dated before the trip had started, before the trip had been confirmed, before any of them could have known they would be standing in this exact clearing. Jennifer scrolled to the last photo in the sequence. It was dated Sunday, June 8th, 4 days in the future. The image showed the clearing, empty, the fire pit cold and dark, The tents gone. 5 backpacks arranged in a neat row at the edge of the trees, as if their owners had set them down and walked away. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, 5 figures standing among the trees, facing the camera, watching. The resolution was too low to make out faces, but the heights were right, the postures were right, the clothes, what little was visible, matched what they were wearing right now. "That's us," Alexis said. Her voice was hollow, distant. "That's us 4 days from now. That's us, and we're not moving." They packed up within the hour. They didn't discuss it, didn't debate, just moved with silent, terrified efficiency, breaking down the camp, shouldering their packs, and hiking out as fast as their legs could carry them. The 3-mile hike took just over an hour. They didn't speak the entire time. When they reached the car, Dylan drove. He didn't stop until they were back in Denver, back in the land of cell service and streetlights and the constant reassuring hum of civilization. They reported the camera to the Forest Service. Rangers investigated. Found nothing. No camera, no zip ties, no evidence that anything had ever been attached to that tree. The SD card, which Jennifer had brought with her, had been reformatted at some point during the drive. Every image was gone. It now contained only one file, a single photo dated June 8th, the same image of the empty clearing, the same 5 backpacks in a row, the same 5 figures standing in the shadows. And now, in resolution that hadn't been there before, 5 faces were clearly visible. Dylan, Alexis, Marcus, Jennifer, Tyler, all 5 of them staring into the camera with expressions that didn't look like them, expressions that didn't look human, expressions that seemed to be waiting for something. That was 4 years ago. All 5 of them made it to college. All 5 of them graduated. All 5 of them are still alive, still healthy, still trying to convince themselves that what they saw was a prank or a glitch or a shared hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion. But none of them have gone camping since, none of them have returned to Colorado, and none of them can explain why every year on June 8th they each receive an email from an address that doesn't exist, containing a single attachment, a photo of themselves taken from somewhere very close while they sleep. The photos are always dated 1 year in the future, and every year Dylan checks the date, counts the days, and wonders what happens when the future finally catches up. These accounts were collected over 18 months from outdoor communities, missing persons forums, and direct interviews with the individuals involved. Each story has been verified to the extent possible, matching missing persons reports, GPS coordinates, photographic evidence, and multiple corroborating witnesses. What remains unverifiable is, of course, the part that matters most, the explanations. The wilderness has always been full of things we don't understand, things that existed before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. Our ancestors built fires to keep them at bay. They told stories to make sense of the sounds in the dark. They avoided certain places that felt wrong, even when they couldn't explain why. We've forgotten most of those instincts. We pack our high-tech gear and follow our GPS coordinates and trust that the world operates according to rules we understand. We forget that the wilderness doesn't follow our rules. It never has. The next time you're alone in the forest, miles from the nearest road, listening to sounds you can't quite identify, remember that you're not the first person to stand in that exact spot. You're not the first person to feel that chill on the back of your neck. You're not the first person to hear footsteps that shouldn't be there, or find evidence of watchers that shouldn't exist, or stumble onto something that time and logic insist is impossible. You're just the latest one in a long line of people who have discovered too late that the wilderness has eyes, And whatever lives out there, in the spaces between the trees, in the dark hours when even the animals fall silent, it has been watching for a very, very long time, and it never forgets a face.